Hey guys, really exciting news. We are finally in Unit 5, so the second last unit of the year. In this unit, we will be focusing on fire regimes and forest management. So, a nice segue from learning about biomes and biodiversity. We're kind of specifically sticking with just a few of those biome types that have this element of fire that has co-evolved with these systems. So by the end of this unit, you will understand that fires are a natural occurrence, and humans have altered the natural fire regimes, and now we are seeing, some negative interactions as we have changed these natural fire regimes. And additionally, we're going to talk about species interactions with fires and how what other characteristics fires bring to these different biomes. So I'm really excited about this as we're rounding out the semester. Again, starting Unit 5, very exciting. And I found this picture just today on Wikipedia. I just searched fire regime, and this is a diagram or a figure that NASA created in 1997. And if you look closely, there are these tiny little red dots, and all of those show a fire that was actually ongoing at that time. And NASA made this figure to show how related these global fires are with the climate. So when it comes to CO2, when it comes to heat, when it comes to atmospheric clarity, you can see that this figure, with all these little red dots, you have these plumes of smoke, and global fires have a global interaction with CO2 and all these different characteristics I just mentioned. So as we move on here, here's just a picture of some firefighters. Actually, interestingly enough, this guy actually has a flamethrower. So they are actually burning this biome type through a prescribed fire. So, it might seem really crazy that there are firemen with flamethrowers, but this is the kind of interactions that humans are doing now to kind of emulate those natural fire regimes that existed before humans. So in the last 20 to 30 years, humans have realized the importance of fire. And this is why you have these workers here actually starting these biomes on fire. And again, that's called a prescribed fire. And at the end of this lecture, I'll talk to you about my friend Eli. Eli works for the Forest Service, the National Forest Service, and he works as a firefighter, and they do carry out prescribed fires. And as you know, the West Coast, up in Oregon, throughout California, there has been some really terrible fires that rage, and he's been a really busy dude, but I'll get into him and his job at the end of this lecture. First things first is that we need to realize that fires are natural. Now, a fire is a chemical reaction, which is the oxidation of different chemicals that occurs when wood is heated to a certain point. So this is chemistry, right? Fire is, resembling a chemical reaction. In drier months and in times of drought, whether it be minor droughts or severe droughts, a single spark can ignite a massive forest fire. Many times, lightning strikes actually cause these forest fires, so you don't even need a human-caused spark. And each ecosystem, pre-human establishment, of course, has evolved its own unique fire regime. So we have this figure next, and we have this red definition, fire regime. So a fire regime is the pattern, frequency, and intensity of the bushfires and wildfires that prevail in an area over long periods of time. So all of these different colors actually are showing different types of fire regimes in place. Now, I really, really like this figure. You can see the grasslands of the Midwest having this type 2 fire regime. And if you paid attention during the last unit, this is reminiscent of the different biomes that we see, right? And I really like this over here. We have the topography of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. You can see that obviously, and we're going to get to this in a future slide, but topography has a direct interaction with fire regime. Topography has a direct interaction with the types of biomes you see, which has, again, a direct interaction with the intensity or frequency or pattern of fires you see. So remember that vertical zonation here. And if you look at where we live, these forest fire regimes are going to be reminiscent of many different mixed deciduous and conifer forests that you find in this region, in this this northeastern region of the country. So really, really cool. I love looking at this and trying to unveil these different patterns that we see throughout our own country. This figure, this researcher Oliver posted, and this is, this was posted in the 90s. I don't actually know the date, but up top is not a fire disturbance, but thunderstorm disturbances. And you could see the darker regions are where many thunderstorms rage. And I just like this because, I know we're focusing on fires, but there are all these different disturbances that occur in, biomes everywhere. Now, the bottom figure is, in fact, fire regimes. And you can see that the West Coast has many more fires than the East Coast does. And that has to do with a lot of things. That has to do with the local climate, right? It's much drier over here. The types of species and the types of human interactions that have been in place here. And we'll get into all of those. Now, the severity of a fire is going to be dependent on external as well as, they both say external. So internal or external forces. Let's change that. Internal and external forces. So an external force is the temperature of the fire or the wind speed, right? So the severity is going to be it's going to be more severe. The forest fires are going to be more severe if the fire is actually hotter, and if there's more wind, there's going to be more oxygen, and the fire will be more intense. So those are external forces. Internal forces are the susceptibility of tree species. Some tree species actually require fire, and they're packed full of resins and they combust really easily, whereas other tree species are fire resistant. So that is an internal force. Additionally, the fuel load in a specific biome is going to be another internal force. So as forest debris builds up, the intensity of that fire may increase because there's just a higher fuel load. So internal and external forces are what fires are dependent on, the severity of fires. Now, there are three drivers of fires that we are going to remember. We have weather, fuel load, and topography. So these are the three drivers of fire that I want you to remember. Obviously, weather has to do with the amount of water a biome receives. Obviously, in years of drought, there's going to be a higher susceptibility of fire. Fuel load, like I just mentioned, if there is, a buildup of debris, and this has happened, and we will get into this later on, but humans in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, we started to put out all fires because people lived near forests, and we didn't want our houses to burn down. And we also, we have all this timber out there that we wanted to protect because you can sell timber. So we put out all these fires, but that has increased the fuel load. So there was much more wood in our forests, and that drove the intensity of fires. So that's yet another driver of fire. And then you have topography, the shape of the land. This has, many facets because, the actual shape of the land. So let's just say the wind is coming this way, right? And if the forest is like in a narrow strip along that path of wind, then that forest is going to be more susceptible to, it's going to have a higher severity as wind pushes fire along the entire forest. Whereas if it was this way, right, if the forest was a narrow strip that was this way and the wind came like this, there'd be less severe fires. So the topography, the shape of the land, right, you talk about elevation as well, wind patterns moving across, large geologic formations might push wind towards or away different areas, and topography is another driver of fire. Depending on the shape of the land, you're going to have different severity and different frequencies of these fires. So I want us to understand this term here, serotinous plants. Serotinous plants are fire adapted plants. So there are many serotinous plants that have evolved, and they have evolved alongside of these natural fire regimes. So of course, some of these plants have taken advantage of these forest fires. For example, we have this jack pine, which is just outside our distribution. It's slightly more north into Ontario and central Canada here. Has a relatively large distribution. You can find this species in Maine. And actually in the Adirondacks, there are a few patches of these jack pines. So they definitely like more northern latitudes where it's colder. And you can look closely at the cone bearing structure, and look at how tight those scales are. And these white little patches on the actual cone are actually resins that hold that cone and those scales super tight. And the only way the seeds within the cone are released is if a fire rolls by. So a fire will heat up those resins and the scales of the cone will actually open up, and then seeds will be released. So really, really interesting. This is obviously a pine tree. Look at the pine needles. The species name is Pinus banksiana. And these are the jack pines. They are serotinous plants. They are adapted to fire. Now, why the heck would, these potential offspring, the seeds, which are extremely vulnerable at this part in their life, why would, this species adapt to release seeds with incoming fire? And we are going to talk about that, but there are several advantages of fire. So as you can tell, fires kind of obviously burn down trees in an area, and this provides new area for new growth, right? No longer are you going to have canopies covering and blocking out the sun if a forest fire comes by. So it does make a lot of sense why certain plants have shifted to a serotinous ecology. And that was just one plant, right? There are several plants. You have the ponderosa pine, Pinus ponderosa. You have the California lilac and the knobcone pine. So conifers tend to, many of them have adapted to a serotinous lifestyle, but also, angiosperms, true flowering plants. Not only plants are serotinous, but there are certain fungi that only pop up after a forest fire. So this is the gray morel. This is a rather rare fungus. The morels are from the genus Morchella, and this is Morchella tomentosa. So very rare fungus. You only find them after freshly burned plots in pine and other conifer-dominated forests. So I've never found one of these. I believe their distribution is more on the west coast anyway. But yeah, I have seen some fungi that have popped up after forest fires as I worked in the southern Appalachia like 4 years ago or so. But we'll get into that. That slide's coming up shortly. Now there's 3 types of forest fires I want us to learn. Ground fires, which is when the duff or, the organic material, that top like soil layer is like smoldering slowly and it just kind of like creeps along. So there are several benefits to these ground fires. A surface fire is a fire that ensues that is beneath the canopy. So shrubs, grasses, maybe some of the bark, but not, and some of the lower branches, not the top of the crown. And then you have the most severe, most intense crown fires. Now these are the types of fires that we're seeing on the West Coast. They're extremely hard to control, and they can actually change the state of that ecosystem for an extremely long time. So surface fires and ground fires, there are these disturbances that permit those ecosystems to actually bounce back to their previous state. They'll function just like how they did, 5 to 10 years after these, less severe fires ensue. But when a crown fire occurs, sometimes that ecosystem is going to be changed for a very long time. And it might not ever bounce back. So we'll learn about that as well. Next, let's look at what fires actually do to those biomes. Now, when we learn about our ancestors, I talked about how our ancestors interacted with fire and how they use fire to increase their fitness. So a couple of terms should be popping up in your head. We have terra preta down in the Amazon, as indigenous people would incorporate ash and charcoal and products of fire, as well as crushed up animal bones to increase the nutrients of their nearby forests to allow the growth of plants that they would eat. Another term, slash and burn. Native Americans would, burn down the, huge areas of grasslands, and that would eventually cause many of their prey species, many of these herbivores, to migrate to those areas, because those animals, they know that really nutritious plants are going to start to grow. So these are underlying themes that we've already talked about. Fire releases nutrients back into the soil. So this chair that I'm sitting on is actually wood. The nutrients and the carbon, the nitrogen, the phosphorus that my houseplants would love to get a hold of, this chair is inaccessible. The nutrients, the products in this chair are inaccessible. To release these nutrients in this chair, the chemical reaction, this burning has to ensue. Burning releases these products. So with that being said, this is a picture that I took working in the southern Appalachian region. I had this really interesting summer job of collecting ants in these ecological plots. So my advisor, who still works at Buffalo State, my dear friend, Dr. Robert Warren, I worked on many of his ant projects. And this is a fire plot. So before we got there, field workers actually burned down a 10 meter by 10 meter plot in the forest. And after a few weeks, I went in and I looked for ant colonies. So that was really interesting. But I found so many cool things besides ants. Look at this. I believe this is a locust sapling. So a small tree that is just this vibrant green color, really highlighting the available nutrients and the available light once this plot was burned to the ground. So again, fire releases nutrients and allows new growth. Burning aids less dominant plants by sharing resources. So many times when a forest is just left alone for long enough and there's no disturbances, a few species will actually tend to dominate. And you actually see biodiversity decrease, which, isn't necessarily good. You want to have biomes that are going to have, a wide array of species, because we know that ecosystem resilience and resistance actually increases with biodiversity. So to protect these ecosystems, we want to maintain biodiversity, and fires actually tend to level the playing field. So they're going to aid the less dominant plants. Fires aid less dominant plants by, releasing these nutrients that are locked up for, several years. So these resources include nutrients, like I just talked about in the last slide, water, space, and light. So with mature trees dying, they're no longer, sequestering water from the biome. So there's more available water. There is more available space, right? Because we don't normally think about space being a resource, right? But a juvenile tree cannot live in this exact position because this tree is occupying that space. So you can see space as a finite resource. There's only so much space in these biomes. And then obviously light, which I just touched upon. Light, with these mature trees burning to the ground, they are going to be no longer filtering out the radiation that will reach the forest floor. So how do we exactly know that, burning plants, these fires cause all of these interactions? So how do we know all this stuff about, how trees grow in relation to fire and such? Well, we know most of our knowledge about trees by actually studying the rings within a tree. Now, this is this discipline, it's a subdiscipline within ecology known as Dendrochronology, which is the science or technique of dating events like environmental change, as well as archaeological artifacts by using the characteristic patterns of annual growth rings in timber and tree trunks. So by looking at a cross-section of a tree, you can actually identify the different years. So in each tree ring, there is early wood and late wood. The early wood is this robust region of the cross section of this annual section here. In the early wood, which occurs in the as soon as the tree actually puts out its leaves, or if it's a conifer, as soon as spring hits, these trees rapidly grow, they rapidly photosynthesize, so they put on a lot of biomass. Then in the fall, when it gets cooler, the metabolism of these trees is reduced, and then finally they actually go dormant for several months, right? So you have this late wood, right? So this region, the tree is not growing fast. It's kind of entering dormancy. The early wood is when it's growing really, really robust. So this ring that I keep looking at, this was a very good year. It was, prime temperatures, enough nutrients, and definitely enough water that permitted this thick early wood. Another interesting thing is that dendrochronology really doesn't exist near the equator. So with trees that grow throughout the year, like tropical rainforests and such, researchers cannot identify different years. Yes, there are growth rings. Yes, there are growth rings. Yes, there are times of the year, of certain years that there's like this punctuated growth, but because there isn't this seasonality, you don't have these definitive rings, and it's nearly impossible to actually date trees in the tropics. So luckily enough for us, we are further away from the equator. There is this seasonality, so we can actually study trees. We can look at dendrochronology and learn so much about not only these trees, but the areas and the disturbances associated with these trees. So here is an old limber pine log with 6 fire scars. This was taken, this tree grew in New Mexico. The inner ring, the oldest parts of the tree, by counting all these rings and by comparing them with dendrochronology data from other trees in this area, you can successfully date these trees, which is crazy. So this inner ring, when this individual actually sprouted, you're looking at the 1300s, right? So by studying dendrochronology, by using this technique, we can understand the fire disturbances of yesteryear. We can see how fire disturbances actually occurred quite regularly, right? It seems like there was a relatively large gap in, from 1480 to 1628. But look at these fire regimes. These early fire regimes were definitely intact. So this is really interesting. You can see all these fire scars. Now, it definitely takes a trained eye to locate and identify different fire scars, but I think it's so cool we can go back in time and understand when these fires ensued, and not only that, but understand how fire regimes have changed. And you can come up and you can kind of be a detective and ask, why did the fire regimes change here? What species might have been introduced here? What was the intensity of these early fires compared to more later fires? So many questions. I wanted to tell you guys about Dendrochronology. It's so cool. If you guys want to hear a podcast, my friend Matt, he talked to a woman who actually wrote a book on Dendrochronology. The podcast is an hour long. It'll blow your socks off. She talks about some of the oldest records of Dendrochronology. She talks about where this field is going, where it has been. So let me know in the comments if you want me to post that podcast. Talking about from this slide, I'm just going through here. Light is also a limiting resource, especially in a closed forest stand. So forest fires are going to open up that stand and allow light to come through and penetrate to the forest floor. Some plants are not serotinous, but they can only germinate with full sunlight. So that's another kind of interesting idea. Sometimes a disturbance is absolutely 100% required for certain species to even germinate, right? So cottonwood trees, for example, are from the genus from the genus poplar. You guys have heard of poplar trees. They are notoriously light limited, so they are a full sun plant. In fact, you rarely ever see these in a closed forest. If you do, it's because they are one of the older individuals there and the forest grew up around it. They will not germinate without full sunlight. So that's an interesting idea there. Now, another idea is that fire actually creates habitat heterogeneity. We learn about habitat heterogeneity in the tropical rainforest biome lecture. And we learn about heterogeneity through that almondro tree. Heterogeneity describes that resources are not shared evenly. So fires actually create more habitat heterogeneity, which means that with fires, you actually get more complexity out of the biome that the fire burned through. So it creates, pockets of, different abiotic factors. Like, let's say, fires, they don't burn uniformly. There are some parts of the fires that might burn hotter. There are parts of the forest that burn completely to the ground, whereas some of the forest is just briefly touched upon by fire. So it creates all this heterogeneity, and we know that heterogeneity, it does increase the amount of species. So the more habitat heterogeneity you have, the more species you have, until you reach this point. Now, this is something we haven't learned about yet. So for the most part, habitat heterogeneity increases species richness. But if you keep fragmenting and causing more and more and more habitat heterogeneity, past a certain point, the species richness is actually decreased. Habitat heterogeneity is good up until a certain point. When the habitat becomes so fragmented and there's too many, different parts, then there isn't enough continuity, and you actually get a lower species richness. But we know that biodiversity, the more biodiversity a biome has, the more ecological functioning. Another theme that's tied closely with fire regimes is bottom-up control. After fires, we know vegetation becomes more nutritious. As herbivores feed voraciously, their population grows because, their food quality actually grows. or gets, better, more nutritious. With this, you're going to have more predators, right? And this is a great example of bottom-up control. The plant primary productivity increases the herbivore biomass, which is going to increase the predator biomass. So again, a great example of bottom-up control, the lowest trophic level controlling the structure of the biome at play. Now, some fungal interactions. Now, this is a fungus, a species that I've encountered in one of these burn plots in the southern Appalachia. And, when you see a mushroom, many people are like, oh, wow, this is like, it must be perfect conditions for this really robust mushroom to grow. For example, like when it rains a ton in the fall, you get, a lot of fungi that pop up on your front lawn. And again, many people are like, wow, it must be like the perfect conditions for the fungus to grow its fruiting body. This is not 100% right. So many times the fungus actually puts out its mushroom as a last chance, a last ditch effort to spread its spores on to the next generation. So your lawn is actually too wet. Fungi are closely related to animals. They actually need oxygen. So with your front lawn being saturated with water, the fungus there, the mycelium that is underneath your front lawn, it's not getting enough oxygen, so it puts out a fruiting body to spread its spores before it, can't really live anymore. So it's kind of like this last ditch effort. Now this species that I found in the southern Appalachia, this was an Amanita species, and it is a mycorrhizal species. So it pairs up with a tree. The tree sends sugars down. The fungus sends nutrients to the tree in this amazing mutualism we know as mycorrhiza. Now, in this burn plot, its host tree was burned to the ground. No longer is this fungus receiving sugars from its host, right? So just like the fungus on your front lawn, as it's, starving of oxygen because of the excess water in your front lawn, this fungus is no longer receiving sugars from its host plant. So again, as a last ditch effort, it puts out its sexual structure, and it releases spores into the air, and hopefully those spores will land by a suitable tree in a plot of the forest that is not completely burned, or maybe burned with new saplings, right? So that'd be a good scenario for it. Now, I hinted upon this. So starting in the 1900s, humans started putting out all fires, right? They wanted to protect their property, their homes, their livestock, right? And what this did was increase the fuel load within forests, right? Normally, natural fires would ensue, and the young individuals, which are more vulnerable to dying from a fire, that vascular cambium of younger trees is definitely more vulnerable to dying. These natural fires would eventually kill these young seedlings. But nowadays, since we put out all these fire, those young seedlings that would normally have been killed mature, and you get all these massive mature trees that increase the amount of wood in these biomes, right? So with an increased amount of wood, there's more fuel for the fire to actually burn. So with all these juvenile trees surviving, our forests have become denser than ever. Obviously, more trees equals a higher fuel load. And once these fires ignite, they are incredibly difficult to contain. So I have some videos here that I really want you to see. I'll put them in the link below. I really like this map in the north eastern region of China. This figure shows the interaction between humans and fires. So anthropogenic fire regimes. Humans have totally shifted fire regimes spatially, temporally, and in intensity. So spatially, you can see these red dots. These red dots are all forest fires. And you can see that in this key here, that the majority of these fires occur along railways and roads. So there's clearly a human interaction, right? So if I were to ask you, why do you think there are more fires around railways and roads, what would you hypothesize? Well, you should think of cigarettes, because humans throw cigarette butts and along roads and highways, and that's where we see all these fires, right? Not many isolated fires exist away from these roads, but those isolated ones, they still might be human. They still might be humans camping, or they could be natural fires. But spatially, we have shifted where fires show up. They're more likely to show up around roads and railways. Temporally, they're actually occurring more frequently now as human population rises. And in intensity, since we put out many fires of the past, there is a higher fuel load, so that when one does ignite, the intensity is higher, right? This is a really cool video about Native Americans and fire interactions. On the West Coast, there are these tribes that are still maintaining these fire regimes that Native Americans have prescribed for hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of years. So there is still, I really, really recommend you watching this video. It's so cool. There are still some of these ancestral fire regime practices being carried out today. Another really, really cool thing about forests, it does tie in with forest fires, is this term, this red term, known as the Wood Wide Web. So the Wood Wide Web was coined about 10 years ago, and researchers realized that trees, before they die, and even throughout their life, are sending sugars through mycorrhizal networks to other tree individuals. So this figure actually represents a stand, a forest stand. The large dark green are the oldest, most mature trees, and they send sugars through these mycorrhizal networks to their and it's crazy, it's not only their own species, they're actually sending sugars to other species, right? So evolutionary biologists are like, why are they increasing the fitness of other species? It's really, really wild. But they are more likely to send sugars to closely related individuals, because those closely related individuals are, they're more related. So they could actually, if there is a distant cousin over here, and its offspring, the trees will actually send more sugars to their offspring, which, evolutionary biologists agree on. It makes sense, right? Because their fitness increases with the increase of their offspring's fitness. So there's that, but not it's so crazy. They send sugars to individuals that aren't even from their own species, which is really crazy. And they also found that right before a tree kicks the bucket, right before it dies, it sends like 80% of its sugars through the Wood Wide Web to other individuals, which is just so crazy. It's so cool. This is some of the reasons why I started to study fungi and mycorrhiza, is like this like benevolence almost, that like this sharing, this mutualism that not only increases the individual's fitness, but the fitness of other individuals outside of its own species. And, you know, this has evolutionary biologists scratching their heads. It has mycologists scratching their heads. But all in all, if the fitness of even different species, of individuals of different species increases, I guess that maybe when they die, those different species will send sugars to the other species. So all in all, it's changing the way we look at forests, and it's changing our understanding about them. And it probably has to do with these longer time scales. It's not so much about, you know, the individual lifetime, but maybe the success of the actual stand. So this sharing and shuffling of products. And another thing I forgot to mention is that the large trees are rarely accepting these sugars. The larger dark green trees, they're called mother trees, and they are going to send sugars to the smaller individuals. The yellow saplings are the smallest ones. They're not sending any sugars away. They're just accepting all of these sugars from around them. So really, really fascinating if you ask me. I love that term, the Wood Wide Web. So I want to finish up this lecture by talking about fire management. And to manage fires, obviously I talked about this right in the beginning. There are, you know, people get hired to actually burn areas in prescribed burning. Now this is going to reduce the understory and dead fuel loads, which is going to decrease the intensity of those fires. There is fuel breaks. So here you have, you know, more of a grassland or shrubland. And here you had, you know, the removal of this giant strip so that if one side starts on fire, it will not be connected and the fire will not be able to reach this other side. So this is a fuel break. And then there are these masticators. So these tree masticators actually just grind trees to a complete pulp and again reduce the fuel load. I got these pictures from my friend Eli's Instagram. I told you that he is a firefighter. He works it's usually 6 months out of the year, but the fire season is kind of getting a little bit longer. So I wouldn't be surprised if he worked, 7 or 8 months this year. He gets a good chunk of change. Again, this is a very demanding and dangerous job, but it is rewarding knowing that you're helping these ecosystems by prescribed burns and straight up, fighting these fires. My friend Eli is awesome. He went to Buff State. I played soccer with him at Buff State. He's an awesome dude. But he, the rest of the year after the fire season's over, he gets to travel the world. So if you're into that kind of nomadic lifestyle, look into, this career choice. Our lack of ecological understanding has, however, greatly impacted these fire regimes and what we see. So this is a specific interaction that has happened. So many times we, removed too much vegetation. As we were scared of forest fires, we removed, many of these fuels. But as we removed so much of these plants, some invasive plants have, took advantage of these open spaces left by, clear cutting and removing trees to reduce fuel loads and prescribe burns. And here we have buffalo grass, which is this non-native grass that has got to areas around the West Coast. These grasses, they burn ridiculously hot. So they burn at like 900 degrees Celsius. And when the invasive buffalo grass goes up in flames, the fires actually burn so hot that the native plants have never experienced such high heat, and they are sterilized. And these extremely hot fires actually sterilize the soil surface, or the sandy soil surface, and the native plants with their seed banks are completely removed, which increases the spread of this buffalo grass. So another great thing humans have done. We tried to help. We removed forest debris. We removed some plant debris to reduce the fuel load, but invasive plants have made their way in, and unfortunately, one of these invaders burns at 900 degrees Celsius and sterilizes the soil and totally changes the ecological state of the systems that it invades. We learned about pine beetles. You had a homework assignment on pine beetles about a month ago. And these pine beetles, again, they bore into these pine trees. They create these galleries. They lay an egg. The egg hatches. And these pine beetles actually spread a fungus that colonizes these galleries. And their offspring actually eats that fungus. Essentially, these pine beetles end up girdling the tree so that the tree actually dies and it's just standing straight up. A dead tree is a very dry tree, so you get the infestations of these, and many of these beetles actually are invasive. So another invasive species that causes these huge areas that obviously hold very little water and that can just go up in flames extremely fast, right? So all it takes is a spark. So that's another biotic interaction. The more pine beetles you have, the higher, the more likely an area is going to get burned. So yeah, I hope you guys liked your first lecture in Unit 5, learning about fires. The result of large unnatural fires is that soils, they're going to become sterilized. The seed banks of both fire adapted and non-fire adapted plants are destroyed. So even in serotinous plants, sometimes these fires are even too intense for them to make it through. Without trees absorbing water and holding the forest floor together, floods and landslides are occurring more and more. So floods and landslides, they might seem like a separate disturbance, but they are closely tied together with these forest fires. And it's going to take much longer for forests to rebound, which limits animal populations, which limits biodiversity. And again, we keep talking about these reoccurring themes. So there is that. Again, I hope you enjoyed this first lecture in Unit 5. Hope you all are happy and healthy. And I will catch you up with a new lecture probably later this week. All right, guys. Have a good one.